Millionaire picked up a 5-year-old girl on the road at night. She didn't tell him why she was alone, but she gave him a note. After reading it, the man turned pale. By all accounts, David Renard had achieved everything most people only dream of. Growing up in a modest household, he'd known the sting of scarcity early on. His family had always been hardworking, but success seemed forever just out of reach. From a young age, David resolved to change his destiny, pouring himself into his studies, later excelling at an Ivy League business school. The determination that drove him through those early years eventually led him to the high-stakes world of finance. With a sharp mind and relentless drive, David soared in his field. He made his first million before the age of 35, and by his 40s, he was a prominent figure, not only in finance but across social circles. David had the means to indulge in any luxury he desired. He owned several sprawling properties across the globe, from a Manhattan penthouse with views of Central Park to a beach house in the Hamptons. His cars were the envy of collectors, sleek, custom, and impeccably maintained. Those who worked closely with him often remarked on his energy and focus. He could negotiate a contract, guide his investment team, and close million-dollar deals before most people even started their day. Wealth, power, and influence defined David's life. Yet, despite his accomplishments and the esteem with which people viewed him, David's life remained disciplined and meticulous, almost guarded. While he enjoyed his successes and was accustomed to high society's glamour, his demeanor set him apart. David wasn't given to ostentatious displays of wealth or fame. Rather, he preferred a quiet lifestyle that only hinted at the immense empire he had built. To the world, he was an unshakable force, a picture of determination and willpower, a man who had it all. Despite the aura of power surrounding David Renard, those close to him knew he was far from the typical ruthless tycoon. Beneath the cold efficiency of his business dealings lay a man of surprising empathy. He had always carried a quiet compassion, an impulse to help those who had less. His success hadn't dulled that sense of kindness. In fact, it only seemed to deepen his desire to give back. David dedicated significant portions of his wealth to various charitable causes, some high-profile and others anonymous. He had founded a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth and regularly sponsored initiatives for educational reform. These weren't just tax write-offs or publicity stunts either. They were genuine efforts rooted in his memories of a difficult childhood. He never forgot where he came from and wanted to be a source of opportunity for others who faced similar hardships. The few friends who knew him well could attest to his unassuming generosity. He had been known to quietly pay off the medical bills of his employees or help cover tuition fees for their children. David preferred not to announce his deeds or seek recognition. Acts of kindness, he felt, were valuable precisely because they didn't demand attention or accolades. And then there were the smaller gestures, things he did simply because he cared. He would buy lunch for strangers who looked down on their luck, and he always kept blankets and bottled water in his car for the homeless he encountered on the streets of New York. He often visited the community centers he funded, taking time to talk with people, hearing their stories, and leaving them feeling seen and valued. Yet, for all his compassion, David's life was fundamentally solitary. His focus on others' well-being was an act of genuine kindness, but also a quiet admission of his own isolation. While he made efforts to be there for others, David lacked a sense of closeness in his own life. It was as if he were watching the world through a glass wall, present, engaged, but ultimately separate. Amidst his philanthropic work, grand successes, and outwardly fulfilled life, a subtle but persistent void weighed on David Renard's soul. In the quiet hours after bustling workdays and the solitude of his expansive, meticulously decorated homes, he felt the emptiness keenly. While he had everything money could buy, the intangible, the feeling of warmth, of family, of true companionship, remained elusive. His friends and colleagues often joked that he was married to his work. There was truth in this, though it hadn't always been his choice. As he focused more on his career and building his empire, personal relationships had simply faded, overshadowed by the endless demands of his ambitions. His few attempts at romance never lasted. He found it difficult to trust people who, in his position, often seemed interested only in what he could offer. Over time, loneliness had become a quiet, constant presence, an uninvited companion he'd learned to live with. His charitable work filled this void temporarily, giving him a sense of purpose and a fleeting connection with the world outside his elite circles. He was fulfilled by giving others a chance at life. Yet, he'd begun to wonder if he had anything in his life that could bring him true peace and meaning. David was haunted by the thought that all his wealth and success couldn't save him from a life of loneliness. Nights were the hardest. While city lights glittered outside his windows and his name circulated in circles of power and influence, he was alone with the awareness that something essential was missing. He yearned for a connection deeper than friendship or professional respect, one that felt genuine and lasting, a sense of family, a bond that couldn't be quantified or bought. His spirit craved an anchor, a purpose beyond profits and philanthropy. The gnawing feeling intensified, leaving him restless and contemplative. He never could have predicted that this emptiness would soon be filled, not by money, fame, or power, but by a small, quiet figure on the side of a dark road. It was a cold, misty night, and David was returning from a long day filled with high-stakes meetings. He'd stayed late to finalize a deal, and the clock had edged past midnight by the time he slipped behind the wheel. The city streets had thinned out, the lively hum of traffic replaced by an eerie silence. David usually avoided driving himself, but tonight he'd wanted to be alone, to breathe in the night air and let the calmness of the empty road settle his restless mind. The road stretched ahead, shrouded in darkness. Fog clung low to the ground, making the streetlights appear distant and faint. David drove slowly, his thoughts drifting, when suddenly he noticed something unusual by the side of the road. A small, lone figure, barely visible in the shadows. He blinked, certain his tired mind was playing tricks on him. But as his car drew closer, the figure became unmistakably clear. A little girl standing silently on the shoulder of the road. Her tiny frame looked fragile, swathed in clothing too thin for the chilly night. She stood unnaturally still, her face turned toward his approaching car. Chill ran through David. He scanned the road around her, searching for someone else, anyone who might be nearby. A parent, a passerby. But there was no one. Just her, bathed in the dim glow of the car's headlights, eyes wide and face expressionless. David's heart tightened. It didn't make sense. She was far too young to be out here alone, especially at this hour. He slowed the car to a halt and lowered the window. The thought of leaving her there, in the dark and cold, was unimaginable. Every instinct in him told him something was wrong. The girl was clearly lost, or worse, abandoned. David stepped out of the car, the chill of the night seeping through his coat as he approached the small figure. The girl barely moved, her expression a mixture of fear and fatigue. She was perhaps 5 years old, her clothes thin, her hair tangled, and her small hands clutching something tightly. "Hey there, sweetheart," David said softly, keeping his voice gentle. "Are you all right? Where are your parents?" She didn't respond. Her gaze flicked up to him briefly, then shifted back to her feet, as if the ground held all the answers she couldn't voice. He noticed a slight tremor in her hands and the faint smudges of dirt on her cheeks. She looked worn out, as if she'd been walking for miles. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken fear and uncertainty. David crouched down, bringing himself to her level. "I'm David," he continued, hoping his calm tone would coax her out of her shell. "It's not safe out here, you know. I can give you a ride somewhere safe. Maybe take you to the police station or help you find your family." Still the girl said nothing. She tightened her grip on the paper she held, glancing at him with large, haunted eyes. David could sense that she was afraid, and perhaps confused by his presence. He searched her face, looking for some sign of what she needed, but all he saw was exhaustion and something else, a sadness that no child her age should know. A wave of protectiveness washed over him. Her silence weighed on him, yet he didn't want to push her. Instead, he reached out his hand slowly, showing her he meant no harm. "You can trust me," he said softly. "I just want to help." Finally she moved. Wordlessly, she extended her small hand, placing the crumpled note she'd been holding into his palm. The paper was old, creased, and smudged, as if it had been held too tightly for too long. David felt a jolt of unease as he straightened up, unfolding the note. Whatever this message was, it seemed to hold an urgency, something she couldn't bring herself to say. David unfolded the paper carefully, its edges worn and the ink smudged in places. The handwriting was shaky and clumsy, the letters large and uneven, as if written by someone young or unpracticed. He scanned the note, feeling an inexplicable dread settling over him as he read the short, broken sentences. Please help her. She has no one. The simplicity of the words struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. He glanced down at the girl, her face unreadable as she watched him with those solemn eyes. The message was scrawled hurriedly, perhaps even with trembling hands, suggesting it was written in a moment of desperation. Questions flooded his mind. Who had written this? Was it the girl herself, or someone who knew her plight? But the note continued with a final line that made his pulse quicken. She can't go back. Please keep her safe. The message was as heart-wrenching as it was cryptic. Keep her safe. From what or from whom? David felt his hands shake as he processed the plea, his own heart echoing the urgency he sensed in the note. Someone had gone to lengths to place this girl in his path, entrusting her safety to a stranger on a dark road. She couldn't go back. Back to what exactly? David looked at her again, feeling an overwhelming urge to protect her. She was just a child, yet she seemed burdened with secrets too heavy for someone so young. His mind raced, weighing his options. She couldn't stay here, and he couldn't leave her to fend for herself. There was a story behind her silence, and a desperation in those eyes that told him she'd endured more than any child should. He took a deep breath, folding the note and slipping it into his coat pocket. He could go to the authorities and let them handle it, yet the thought of her disappearing into a system, possibly into the very circumstances she seemed to have escaped, felt wrong. David knelt down, looking her in the eyes. "I don't know what's happened, but I promise, I'll keep you safe." With those words, she reached out, gripping his hand with surprising strength. It was as if, for the first time, she felt she could let herself trust. And in that moment, David knew his life was about to change forever. David guided the girl gently to his car, opening the door and helping her climb in. She settled into the seat quietly, her small frame dwarfed by the plush leather. As he pulled onto the road, he glanced over at her, noting the way she stared out the window, her eyes distant and expression unreadable. She seemed almost fragile, like she might disappear if he looked away too long. The silence in the car was heavy, thick with questions he wanted to ask but couldn't bring himself to voice. Where had she come from? Who had written that desperate note? He'd hoped she might speak once they were safely away from the lonely stretch of road, but she remained mute, her small fingers gripping the edge of her seat. David fought the impulse to push her for answers, sensing that she would speak when she was ready. Or perhaps, he thought grimly, she had no words for what she'd endured. As they drove through the dimly lit streets, he couldn't shake the haunting image of her standing alone on that road, the emptiness of her expression, as if she'd been left without hope. He tried to keep his own mind steady, focusing instead on where to take her. The police station crossed his mind, yet the note's words echoed. She can't go back. With a quick decision, David changed course and headed for the nearest hospital. A medical professional could check her over, ensure she was healthy and uninjured. He only hoped that somewhere in this process, someone could provide answers. The thought of her alone, suffering in silence, made his heart twist in ways he hadn't expected. The city lights blurred as they passed, and he caught her stealing glances at him. Each look was filled with uncertainty and something else. Perhaps a flicker of hope? David wasn't sure. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised even him, that he was meant to help her, whatever that would entail. As they neared the hospital, David stole a few glances at the girl. Under the streetlights, he could see her more clearly. Her cheeks were smudged with dirt, and her clothes, simple and faded, were too thin for the chill of the night. Her hair, tangled and dry, fell in disarray around her small face, and her fingernails were chipped and dirty, signs of neglect that tugged at David's heart. Each new detail deepened the mystery and amplified his worry. He noticed faint bruises on her wrists, like shadows beneath her skin, and his stomach knotted at the implications. How long had she been alone? Had someone hurt her, or had these bruises come from her own struggles to survive? His protective instincts flared, and he clenched the steering wheel, fighting the anger rising within him. The girl shifted in her seat, catching him looking. She dropped her gaze immediately, her shoulders curling in on themselves as if to make herself smaller, invisible. It was a reaction David had seen before, in people accustomed to hardship, to being overlooked or mistreated. It struck him that, at such a young age, she'd already learned how to shrink into the background, as if to avoid unwanted attention. It was a survival skill no child should ever need. David cleared his throat, trying to sound gentle. "We're almost there," he said softly. "The doctors are going to make sure you're okay. After that, I'll be here, and we'll figure out what to do next." She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on her knees. But he saw her nod, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if she was allowing herself to accept his help. Just a little. David's heart ached with questions he couldn't bring himself to ask, but one thing became increasingly clear. Whatever had happened to her was beyond what any child should ever endure. And he was more determined than ever to keep his promise. David pulled up to the emergency entrance of the hospital, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the quiet parking lot. He helped the girl out of the car, her small hand slipping into his with a hesitant trust that both comforted and unsettled him. Together they walked into the hospital lobby, the warmth of the building a stark contrast to the cold night outside. A nurse at the front desk noticed them immediately, her brow furrowing as she took in the little girl's disheveled appearance. David approached, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring, though he felt his own anxiety mounting. "This child, she was alone on the road," he explained. "She doesn't seem to have anyone with her, and I'm not sure if she's injured. I thought it best to bring her here." The nurse nodded, her gaze softening as she looked down at the girl. "Course, we'll get her checked out right away. Do you know her name, or where she might be from?" David glanced at the girl, who avoided his eyes, shifting closer to his side but saying nothing. He shook his head. "She hasn't said much. I found a note, but it doesn't explain much about her or her situation." The nurse's expression turned serious as she called over a doctor and another nurse to assist. They guided the girl to an examination room, her small hand lingering in David's until the last possible moment before she let go. The separation felt oddly painful, as if he were giving up part of his responsibility for her, even if only for a moment. After a while, the doctor emerged with a somber expression. "She's unharmed physically, other than some minor bruising and signs of exhaustion. But she's clearly malnourished, and there are indications of neglect. We'll need to involve child services. They'll look into her case and try to locate her family." David's stomach clenched at the mention of child services. "Is there any other option? She seems terrified of the idea of going back to where she came from." The doctor studied David for a moment, as if assessing his intentions. "If there's any reason to believe she's at risk, child services will investigate thoroughly. For now, they'll find a temporary placement, though the process can be difficult." David nodded, his heart heavy. As the doctor spoke, a surge of determination rose within him. He couldn't walk away from her, not now. Whatever it took, he was going to make sure she was safe. Later that evening, as David waited anxiously in the hospital lounge, a social worker arrived. She introduced herself as Ms. Harlow, a woman with a warm demeanor and a calm voice that seemed to command both respect and trust. David felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she could help piece together this heartbreaking puzzle. Ms. Harlow sat beside him, opening a worn folder with a few papers she had hastily compiled. We were able to gather some initial information, she began. It seems the girl's name is Emily. She paused, gauging David's reaction, then continued gently. Her situation is difficult. As she explained, the story began to unfold like a tragedy. Emily had lived with her grandmother, an elderly woman who had taken full custody after Emily's parents had drifted in and out of her life. Her parents, both struggling with addictions, had left Emily with her grandmother, unable or unwilling to care for her. For years, Emily's grandmother had provided for her, offering her a stable, loving home despite their limited means. But in recent months, things had changed. The grandmother's health began to fail, and her ability to care for Emily had waned. Child services had occasionally checked in, but with no other family members to turn to, Emily had been left in a precarious situation. The final blow had come just days ago when her grandmother had passed away suddenly, leaving Emily utterly alone. No extended family had stepped forward, and the few neighbors who had known them were unaware of Emily's situation. In her isolation and grief, the little girl had ventured out, carrying only a note, a final plea, most likely written by her grandmother in a desperate attempt to find someone who might care for her. David listened, each revelation tightening the grip of sorrow in his chest. He couldn't imagine the fear Emily must have felt, her world collapsing without warning. The note made perfect sense now, a last-ditch attempt by a loving woman to save her granddaughter from an uncertain future. David's mind was swirling with the pieces of Emily's story, and with each new detail, he felt the weight of her pain and desperation sink deeper into his heart. Ms. Harlow continued, recounting the events that had led to Emily's journey alone on that dark road. When Emily's grandmother had passed, it seemed no one had come to check on her. Days went by, and with no one to care for her, Emily had been left to fend for herself in a silent, empty house. There, surrounded by the echoes of her grandmother's love and the emptiness that had replaced it, the little girl had tried to be strong. She ate what little food she could find and clung to the few possessions left behind. But as the days blurred together, fear crept in. She must have realized no one was coming for her. Perhaps she grew afraid of being discovered alone, worried that she'd be taken somewhere she didn't understand. Or maybe, she simply couldn't bear the loneliness any longer. Finally, in her desperation, she'd left, clutching that single piece of paper, a note her grandmother must have written shortly before she passed, asking anyone to help Emily. She wandered around town, confused and frightened, Ms. Harlow said, her voice growing softer. A homeless man noticed her one night, and after learning that she had nowhere to go, he pointed her in the direction of the main road, hoping she might find help. David's throat tightened as he pictured it. This small, lost child following the only guidance given to her, walking down that dark road with nothing but a crumpled note in her hand. It was sheer luck, no, perhaps fate, that he had passed by at just the right moment to see her, to save her. Ms. Harlow sighed, her eyes betraying the toll of years spent seeing such hardship. Emily's story isn't uncommon, I'm afraid, she said quietly. But that doesn't make it any less tragic. David sat back, absorbing her words, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Emily's life had been a fragile thing, hanging by a thread, and somehow that thread had led her to him. He couldn't turn away, not now. Emily needed someone, needed a place to belong, and he knew deep down that he wanted to be the one to give her that chance. David listened as Ms. Harlow continued, her voice softer now, as if the weight of Emily's story were resting heavily on her too. The note Emily had carried was likely written by her grandmother in a final, desperate act of love. Knowing her health was fading, she must have worried endlessly about what would happen to Emily. With no one else to trust, the grandmother had scrawled those words in the hope that a stranger, someone kind, would find her granddaughter and offer her the safety she couldn't guarantee herself. The social worker explained that after her grandmother's passing, Emily had roamed the streets, clutching that note as though it were a talisman that could deliver her to someone who would care. She'd likely been scared and alone when the homeless man, noticing her distress, had offered her some help. He told her to follow the main road until she found someone willing to help her, Ms. Harlow said, shaking her head. He must have seen something of himself in her loneliness and wanted to make sure she didn't end up like him. That simple act of kindness set her on the path to you, Mr. Renard. You're the one who stopped, the one who saw her. David felt an indescribable emotion well up inside him. A quiet man with nothing to give but directions had made sure Emily found her way to safety. It was a testament to human decency, to people who were often overlooked by society but whose kindness had saved her from an uncertain fate. It was this chance encounter that had brought Emily into his life, and he couldn't ignore how fortuitous, how purposeful it all seemed. Ms. Harlow looked at David with a searching gaze. Sometimes children like Emily fall through the cracks. But she was lucky, she found someone who stopped to listen. He looked down at the small, crumpled note, feeling its weight in his hand. He couldn't imagine the courage it had taken for Emily to hold on to hope despite her circumstances. Her trust in him, fragile yet resilient, was a gift he couldn't turn away from. He was certain more than ever that he wanted to be the one to keep her safe. David left the hospital that night feeling as if the world had shifted under his feet. The streets outside were quiet, the city alive with 1,000 silent stories, but none felt as important as the one he had just learned. He walked to his car slowly, his mind swirling with thoughts of Emily, of her life before he found her, of everything she had endured. Her small figure haunted him, her silence and stoic gaze leaving an indelible mark on him. As he sat behind the wheel, he didn't turn the key right away. Instead, he let his thoughts drift over the strange path that had brought him to this moment. He'd spent his life building his empire, chasing success and significance, only to feel something essential slipping away. Now, with one chance encounter, the missing piece had revealed itself. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected that an orphaned little girl, carrying nothing but a note and a broken heart, would be the one to bring him clarity. Emily had no one else. There were no distant relatives, no family friends willing to step forward. She'd been left completely alone, and for reasons he couldn't explain, David felt that he was the one meant to be there for her. The more he reflected on it, the more certain he felt. This was the purpose he'd been searching for, the reason he'd never felt fulfilled by all his accomplishments. The thought of turning her over to a system that might not understand her pain, that might place her somewhere cold and indifferent, felt unthinkable. She'd already suffered too much, and she deserved a chance at a life filled with love, warmth, and stability. For the first time in years, David felt certain about something beyond his career, beyond any material ambition. He didn't just want to help her. He wanted to give her a home. The following morning, David returned to the hospital, carrying a determination that felt both new and invigorating. He went directly to Ms. Harlow's office, knowing he had to speak with her before the day's bureaucracy swept Emily's case into the hands of people who might see her as just another number, another name on a long list of children waiting for care. Ms. Harlow looked up from her desk as he entered, her face registering surprise but softening when she saw his expression. "Mr. Renard," she greeted him warmly. "Is everything all right?" David took a seat, hands resting firmly on the armrests as he prepared to explain. "Ms. Harlow," he began, his voice steady, "I haven't been able to stop thinking about Emily's situation. I know there's a protocol for cases like hers, but I don't believe she should go through the foster system." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to do more than just ensure she's safe. I want to take care of her, myself." Ms. Harlow's eyes widened briefly, but she quickly nodded, recognizing his sincerity. "Mr. Renard, fostering or adopting a child is a significant responsibility. It's wonderful that you're considering it, but the process is complex, and it's not something we usually rush into." David leaned forward, his tone earnest. "I understand that, and I'm willing to go through whatever is required. I have the resources to support her, to give her a stable home. And more than that," his voice softened, "she deserves someone who genuinely wants her to feel safe. I want her to know she has someone in her corner." Ms. Harlow's expression grew thoughtful, her professional demeanor softening as she realized the depth of David's commitment. "It's rare to find someone so dedicated to a child they've only just met," she said quietly, but you've already shown her more care than many others might. David nodded, a warmth spreading through him as he realized he was making a real difference in Emily's life. Tell me what I need to do, he said. Whatever it takes, I'm ready to bring her home. Ms. Harlow smiled, pulling out a folder from her desk. All right, Mr. Renard. Let's get started. Over the next few days, David immersed himself in a world entirely foreign to him. Child welfare paperwork, home evaluations, interviews with social services, all the necessary steps to prove his commitment and suitability as a guardian for Emily. The legal requirements were daunting, but he took each one in stride, driven by the unwavering resolve that had once propelled him through his career. This time, however, his determination was fueled not by ambition, but by something much deeper, a fierce need to protect and care for a child who had no one else. In between the formalities, David visited Emily daily, bringing small gifts and spending time with her in the hospital's playroom. At first, she was shy, her words sparse and her smiles fleeting. But little by little, she began to open up, her small hands reaching out to him as she grew comfortable with his presence. She never asked questions about what would happen next, but David could see the relief in her eyes whenever he assured her, "I'm not going anywhere." Finally, the day arrived. With all the paperwork in place, David was granted temporary custody of Emily, with a path open for him to adopt her if he chose to do so. He felt a mixture of joy, awe, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility as he signed the last document, sealing his commitment to her. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, as if he were exactly where he was meant to be. That afternoon, as he walked Emily out of the hospital and into her new life, she looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Are we going to your home now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. David knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "Yes, Emily," he replied, his voice filled with warmth. "You're home now too." With those words, Emily smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly as they walked toward the car together, her trust in him solidifying with each step. In that moment, David knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them gladly. He had found his purpose in giving this small, resilient child the family she deserved, and in doing so, he had finally found the family he'd always yearned for as well. Emily clung to David's hand as they entered his home, a spacious yet understated house filled with warm light and elegant simplicity. She hesitated in the entryway, her small frame dwarfed by the high ceilings and grand decor, yet her eyes were wide with wonder as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. David watched her, noticing how she moved slowly, almost timidly, her gaze darting around the room as though she were trying to make sense of this new environment. To make her feel at ease, he crouched beside her, pointing to a doorway just down the hall. "Come on," he said, a gentle smile on his face. "Let me show you your room." He led her down the hallway to a cozy bedroom he'd arranged just for her. It was simple but welcoming, with soft bedding, stuffed animals, and a small shelf lined with books he hoped she might enjoy. Emily walked inside, her fingers trailing along the walls and her eyes drawn to every corner. She paused by the bed, hesitating before reaching out to touch the plush blanket. "It's yours, Emily," David said, his voice soft. "Everything here is yours now." Emily looked up at him, a tentative smile breaking across her face. She seemed to be absorbing his words, letting them settle. Then, in a small voice, she whispered, "I've never had a room like this before." David's heart ached as he realized just how new and overwhelming all of this was for her. But as she began to explore, moving slowly but confidently, he felt a profound gratitude for being able to offer her this fresh start, a chance to experience a world where she could finally feel safe, wanted, and loved. As the days turned into weeks, Emily gradually settled into her new life. Her initial shyness began to melt away, replaced by a quiet curiosity and a spark of joy that grew a little brighter each day. David made every effort to create a routine that felt safe and predictable for her. Each morning they shared breakfast together, pancakes quickly becoming her favorite, and every evening they read stories before bed, a ritual she seemed to cherish. One afternoon, David surprised her with a trip to the park. She looked at him with wide eyes, as if uncertain whether she could believe her luck. But soon she was racing across the grass, her laughter filling the air as she chased a kite he'd brought for them to fly together. Watching her play, seeing her run and laugh so freely, David felt his heart swell with a happiness he hadn't known before. This was what he'd been missing. The simple, profound joy of connection, of watching someone he cared for experience happiness. Back at home, Emily began to open up more, sharing bits and pieces of her past. She talked about her grandmother, her eyes soft and sad, but there was a new resilience in her voice. In these quiet moments, David realized just how brave she was. How, even in the face of loss and hardship, she still had the capacity to trust, to laugh, to hope. One evening, after a particularly joyous day, Emily surprised him by climbing onto the sofa beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. David's breath caught, the simple gesture filling him with an overwhelming sense of love and responsibility. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, as if to reassure her that he would never let her go. In these small, precious moments they became a family. It was as if they'd each been waiting for this without knowing it. Two lost souls who had finally found their home in each other. Months passed, and Emily blossomed in ways David had never imagined. She became more confident, her once quiet smiles now turning into bright, unrestrained laughter that filled every corner of their home. David cherished each moment, each small sign that she was healing, that the shadows of her past were beginning to fade. Their bond grew stronger, a quiet understanding between them that they were no longer alone. One evening, David returned home after a late business meeting. He opened the front door to find Emily waiting for him, wrapped in her favorite blanket, a look of excitement lighting up her face. She ran to him, her arms outstretched, and he lifted her up, twirling her around as her laughter echoed through the house. After he set her down, she looked up at him, her eyes serious, yet filled with a warmth he'd grown to cherish. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers curling around his, and with a shy smile, she said softly, "Good night, Dad." The words caught him off guard, and he felt his heart swell with a depth of emotion he'd never known. He knelt down, meeting her gaze, and gently brushed a lock of hair from her face. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude and love. In that moment, everything felt complete. David realized that all the wealth, all the success he had amassed, had been leading him to this chance to give and receive love in its purest form. Emily had given him a purpose, a joy beyond anything he'd ever achieved, and he had given her the family she so deeply deserved. As she hugged him tightly, he knew that they had both found their way home at last. They had both found the family they'd been searching for, the family they would now build together, one day at a time. And for the first time in his life, David Renard felt that he truly had it all.